Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about my favourite historical novels. This is a video I've been meaning to make for ages, but I have been specifically prompted to make it now because the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction has recently launched an effort to discover the nation's favourite historical novel of all time. So the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction is a prize for historical fiction, which I have been following for a little while and I really enjoy. This year I read quite a lot of the books on the long list, and in 2020 it will be the 10th year that the prize has run, I believe. So they have invited the public to nominate their favourite historical novels. This is like the UK public they've invited. Obviously I know not all of you watching are from the UK, this is a UK book prize, but basically on the Walter Scott Prize's website you can nominate, I believe, up to 15 novels, and then the books that get nominated the most, they will kind of create a long list of the nation's favourite historical novel, which I think is really fun. So I thought, as you can nominate 15 books for that, I would tell you my 15 favourite historical novels today and then go and nominate them on the website, and any of you watching who live in the UK, do go and nominate your favourite historical novels as well. So the way the Walter Scott Prize classes a historical fiction novel is, I believe, a book where at least half the action takes place 60 years before the book was published. So I have 15 historical books I want to talk to you about today. I love all of these a lot. These are fantastic novels. One thing I feel like I should say before I start is that you may notice that my favourite novel of all time, The 13th Tale, is not in this list. And that is because I don't really consider The 13th Tale a historical novel. I think it would probably qualify in that I would say half the action does take place 60 years before the book is set, or certainly nearly half the action does. But I don't quite feel it's the same thing as the other books I'm going to be talking about. Though fear not, Diane Cetaphil's other two novels are in here, of course. So let's get straight into the book. At number 15, I have Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. This is a brilliant novel that I really love. It is a slightly fantastical historical fiction novel in that it is set in the kind of early first half of the 20th century, and it follows this woman who every time she dies gets reborn and gets to try her life over and over again, but sometimes she vaguely remembers things from her last life and then things go differently every time. It's really, really fantastic. I like that element very much. I think it's very, very cleverly done, but the thing I think that is the best about Life After Life is that this novel describes the Blitz just fantastically. I've never read a novel that's described the Blitz quite so well. Bits of it are horrifying, but it's absolutely brilliantly written and like creates the atmosphere of that time period so well. Yeah, it's a really fantastic book and one I would highly recommend, and this has reminded me that I really need to read more Kate Atkinson. At number 14, I have The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. It is set in 17th century Amsterdam, and we follow this young woman who goes to work as a maid in the house of an artist and kind of sort of becomes friends with the artist in a way. The premise being that she is the girl from this painting, which is a real painting. It's a really, really powerful book. I just think like there are character relationships in this are drawn so well. The historical time period is drawn so well. I found it really, really compelling and just, yeah, it's a really, really fantastic read. At number 13, I have Washington Black by Essie Edgeguan. This is a brilliant novel that I read last year, I think, and just really, really enjoyed. It's set in 19th century America and it follows a young boy called Washington Black who is a slave, and what happens when he ends up sort of on the run with his master's brother who kind of sees potential in him and takes him on as a kind of scientific assistant. It is a fantastic book. It travels kind of all around the world. It's got a real like adventure vibe to it, as well as really interestingly dealing with a lot of complex historical issues. It's such a great book. I just really, really loved it. I love the writing as well. It feels quite Dickensian in many ways, so it's just definitely one I would highly recommend. At number 12, I have Now We Shall Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller. This was actually shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize this year, and it was my favourite to win, though it did not win. It was definitely my favourite of the ones that I read. This is set in early 19th century Britain, and we follow a man who has just come back from the Napoleonic Wars, who has kind of been emotionally scarred by it. And we're not sure from the beginning whether he's been emotionally scarred by what he has seen done or what he himself has done. And at the same time, we're following two men who are kind of following him and chasing him across Britain, and we kind of find out why over the course of this book. There are a lot of fantastic things about this. I think it's beautifully written. I think the way it looks at the time period is fascinating. I also think the way that this looks at disability is really, really clever. The main character has partially lost his hearing in the war, and there is another character in the second half of the book who has partially lost her sight, and they end up relying on each other for the senses that they lack in a way that it's really hard to explain how well it is done and how cleverly it is done. It's such a fantastic dramatic book, so exciting, so powerful. I love this one a lot. At number 11 I have Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. This is set in 19th century America. You will notice there are quite a lot of 19th century historical books here. It's my favourite time period to learn about. This is set in 19th century America and we follow these two men over the course of their lives. They're soldiers, they're also a couple, they're a family. They later adopt a Native American girl. They fight together in the Indian Wars and the Civil Wars, and we kind of see their relationship grow and change and how they change as characters over the course of these wars. It is a brilliant, brilliant book. So well written, so engaging, beautifully moving. Like, the love story in here is just so lovely, and yeah, I love this a lot. At number 10 I have God's Children by Malby Roberts, which I read earlier this year and just absolutely loved. This is a novel, but it's inspired by the true life of a woman called Kate Marsden, who was a British nurse in the 19th century who kind of raised money for and ran expeditions to try and find a cure for leprosy. And this book follows her and her efforts to try and find a cure for that, but also her relationships with women and what happened when her romantic relationships with women were exposed to the public. So it's absolutely fascinating history and such a brilliant book. So well written, so powerful and moving, and the way that Malby Roberts weaves all the different narratives together and all the different timelines together is just so clever. At number 9 I have Affinity by Sarah Waters. Affinity is set in 19th century Britain. No one will be surprised. It follows this young woman. We know she's recently been very kind of unhappy. We know that there is a bit of a mystery about what's happened recently, but her family are all very worried about her. And she, to kind of distract herself from her life, ends up volunteering in this women's prison. And there she meets this woman who is there because she is accused of having attacked someone. But this prisoner, Serena, claims that it was not she that attacked someone, but a ghost, and that she is a medium for spirits. And our narrator kind of gets more and more interested in and more compelled by and obsessed with Serena as the book goes on. It is so clever, it is so twisty, like the historic setting is perfect and so well explored, and the way this looks at the position of women in Victorian society, like all of Sarah Waters' books, is just fantastic, and yeah, so compelling and so good. I would highly recommend. At number 8 I have A Place Called Winter by Patrick Gale. This is a wonderful novel which I read last year and absolutely loved. It's set in Edwardian England and Canada. We follow a man called Harry and what happens when he is forced to leave his home, his wife and child, after an affair he has with another man, and we follow him as he migrates to Canada and tries to build a life for himself there, and the relationships with all the different people he meets. It's really compelling, really dramatic, so well done. I found this a really interesting frontier novel because I feel like I've read quite a lot of books about settlers in the USA, but not very many about settlers in Canada, and this was absolutely fascinating. I also loved the central character so much. I thought he was so cleverly done, and the relationship he has with all the characters around him is just fantastic. Yeah, would highly recommend this. At number 7 I have Bellman and Black by Diane Cetaphil. I did promise she would be on here. This is a brilliant novel. It is set in 19th century Britain, and we follow a man called William Bellman from his childhood into his adulthood, and basically we follow him and his relationship with death and the way that various people around him die and how that changes him as a person. We also follow his working life. He is a very shrewd businessman, and he goes from kind of running this mill to founding this emporium of mourning wear and grief and death. Like, the whole book is about the Victorian obsession with death and mourning, and we follow Will Bellman and how his life has changed because of his relationship with death, and also the fact that he is somewhat haunted by a man who may or may not be real. It is very cool. It's fantastically written, like all of Diane Cetaphil's books. It is so engaging, so beautifully done, and just, yeah, I love this a lot, and I would highly recommend it. At number 6 I have When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro. So I was slightly tempted to include in here The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, but as I am talking about the Walter Scott Prize a bit today, and The Remains of the Day was published in the 80s, and the bulk of it is set in the 30s and the 50s, it doesn't actually officially count as a historical novel by the Walter Scott Prize's definition, so I'm not including that here. I know it's like an arbitrary definition, but that is what I'm using for this video today. But anyway, When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro is a brilliant book, and I think really underrated, because I hear Never Let Me Go and The Remains of the Day talked about a lot, but this is my third favourite book by him after those two, and I think it's fantastic. It follows a young man in the early 20th century in Shanghai and England. This young man was brought up as a boy in Shanghai, moved back to England after his parents went missing, and he's kind of been haunted by his childhood and what may or may not have happened to his parents for a long time. He has become a detective, a kind of Sherlock Holmes figure, and he ends up travelling back to Shanghai in the 1930s when there is a very complicated political situation there, to try and find his parents, and also finds out more about his past on the way. Like all of Ishiguro's books, it is about memory and about looking back. It's also a fantastic exploration of a really interesting period in history, and just, yeah, I would really highly recommend this. It is such a great book. I actually would kind of like to read it again now that I've been to Shanghai, because I've read this before I'd been to Shanghai, and now I feel like there's little bits I'd get which I didn't before. But yeah, such a fantastic book. At number 5, I have The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. I'm glad to be able to talk about this because I feel like I haven't spoken about this book for ages, and I did love it so much. It's such a good book. This is set in the 19th century, is anyone surprised, but in New Zealand this time, not in Britain. And it follows various characters, quite a lot of characters in fact. I think there are 13 main characters, and these various characters are all sort of tied up in a series of mysterious crimes that have happened in a town in New Zealand surrounding gold mines, and we kind of follow the stories of all of these different characters and what has happened that has led to these crimes. It's a very complicated and long book, but it's so fantastic and so worth the read and worth the wait because it is so compelling and so powerful, and when you get to the end, like, it's so rewarding. Like, it is a big book, but it didn't feel long at all to me. I just felt like so incredibly invested in it while reading it because all of the characters are so fully fledged and so entirely brought to life, which is tough when you have that many characters, but it's done brilliantly. Also the exploration of the time period and the country, because I don't know that much about the history of New Zealand, and the way this book looks at late 19th century New Zealand is just absolutely fascinating. I would highly, highly recommend this. Such a great book. At number 4, we have The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. I read this, I think, nearly 2 years ago now, and just absolutely fell in love with it. This is set in late 17th century Amsterdam, and we follow a young woman who, at the very beginning of the book, gets married to a man that she doesn't know very well. She's feeling a bit uncertain about it, especially when he seems quite cold with her and doesn't seem to want very much to do with her, although she is now living in his house with him and his sister and 2 servants. And as a wedding present, her husband gives her this giant doll's house, which she starts to furnish, and then things start to move in the doll's house that seem to predict the future. However, the doll's house element is not actually the most important thing in this book. I feel like that's the hook that people use to sell this book by, but actually the little bit of magic in here is not actually that important, and what this book really is a really fascinating exploration of social issues and social prejudices in 17th century Amsterdam. And that is what I love it for, and that is what is absolutely brilliant about it. It's also really twisty and turny and really gripping, and all of the twists, I just didn't see any of them coming. So, so good. I would highly, highly recommend. At number 3, we have Once Upon a River by Diane Cetaphil. This is a fantastic novel which I read earlier this year and just loved a lot. This is set in 19th century Britain, set around this inn on the Thames, and what happens when one night an injured man and a child burst into this inn. The man is severely injured, but they start to heal him, and the girl seems to be dead. Suddenly she is dead, until suddenly she isn't dead anymore. And this little child is kind of the focal point of this book, whether or not she was dead, how she came back to life, whether or not she was always alive, who she is, where she comes from. Various people kind of lay claim to this child, and the book follows what goes on from there. It is absolutely fantastic. It's full of like all of Diane Cetaphil's books, it's really richly written, full of this love of storytelling, with so many interesting characters who are so fully fledged and so interestingly developed and so well weaved together. I love this so much. It's just beautiful and powerful, and yeah, I really, really recommend this. This is such a fantastic book, and yeah, Diane Cetaphil did it again. At number 2, I have The Wonder by Emma Donoghue. This is another one that I read earlier this year and really, really loved so much. This is set in 19th century Ireland and follows an English nurse who has been sent to Ireland in order to watch over a small child, a little girl who claims she has not eaten anything for months. And the question is, how is she staying alive? Is it possible that she's staying alive? Is she actually being given food from a secret source, or is she in some way a miracle? And our nurse Liv is kind of there to discover what's going on. This is a fantastic book. It is brilliantly written. It is incredibly compelling and powerful. The narrative takes place over just a couple of weeks, and yet it feels so claustrophobic and intense and dramatic. It's so powerful and it entirely grips you. It's just, yeah, I can't remember the last time in a book that I felt like so thoroughly, entirely in the story. It's just absolutely fantastic and I would highly recommend it. But finally, my favourite historical fiction novel is anybody surprised, The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley. This is set in, can anybody guess, 19th century Britain. I obviously clearly have a favourite time period. This follows a young man called Nathaniel. He wants to be a musician, but he has a sister and nephews to support, so he works as a clerk in the civil service. His life is quite dull and ordinary and everything goes by routine until one day a pocket watch is left on his bed in his lodgings for no reason. And by finding the maker of the pocket watch, a Japanese man called Keita Mori, his whole life changes. And it's so good, it's so good. I don't know what more to say. It's so fantastic. This book contains all of the things that I love in historical fiction. The Victorian period, exploration of themes that were not written about much or couldn't be explored in the Victorian period, really fantastic central characters. Japan, which, if you don't know, as well as being obsessed with the Victorian period, I'm slightly obsessed with Japan. I'm really, really interested in Japanese history and culture, so that is definitely a plus for this book. Also, there's clockwork, and I'm like nerdily into clockwork, including a clockwork octopus who like walks around Keita Mori's shop. I mean, how cool is that? And it's also got a little bit of magic, not too much magic, but a little bit of magic. What I love about this book is that it is the perfect balance between quirky and really fun, but also really interestingly and cleverly exploring Victorian social issues. That is what I like in a historical fiction novel. I like to have a mix between like fun adventure vibes with a really dramatic, exciting plot, but also really interesting like historical analysis of a time period. That's what I like, and that this book has that a lot, and I love it, and I love it a lot. I love it so much, it's so good. And there we have it. Those are my top 15 historical fiction novels. I feel like this has been quite a long video, but I hope some of you will have enjoyed it. Please do let me know down in the comments what your favourite historical fiction novel is, and also if you have any other recommendations for me to read based on all of these things that I love. I would really like to know. And yeah, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.